get started. I'm just going to record this, show my screen. I'll just say screen on monitor 2. Share. Okay. All right, welcome. Happy Friday. Today we're going to talk about Revit tips and tricks. In the past I did a lot of this, but today I'm just going to be down to more of stuff that I always find user made a mistake and don't understand what's going on. So for the topic for today, I'm going to talk about a couple things. One of them is going to be room computation height, elevation, or section, how do you fade it. Roof is a big one. I know that in this office you will encounter some roof, and how do you use roof tools just to do like the hips, the gable roof type of things. The next thing I'm also going to talk about is family. Sometimes what happens is that family, when you put it on a plan, it looks very straight, but sometimes you want the object to be hosted on angles. How do you do that? Okay, so that's the next thing. Height tags coarser with scale. This is one of the big issues. Sometimes users just saying, okay, where's my tag? Okay, so how do you control that? Lastly, I'll talk about 2D, 3D grips, and sometimes users get mixed up with those two, as well as how to control it using scope boxes. And sometimes what happens is that you do have angle. I'm not sure if you have done arc type of grid lines, because I know that some projects I've worked on, you do have an arc. So if you want to create an arc grid lines, how do you control those? All right, let's move on to tips and tricks. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the room computation height. So I'm just going to open up just a sample project, not right now. So what happened with the room computation height? I'm just going to create a new project, a very simple one. So let's assume that you have a wall. Okay, let's assume this is the same. I'm just going to copy this over. One of them is going to have an offset of, let's say, 100 millimeters. So when you put a room, it works there, but when you start putting that room into another one, it just tells you it doesn't work. Okay, how do you control that? So one of the ways I would typically do before I do anything, make sure the rooms are shown. So one of the ways I usually do, I should close this out, close this project. There is a tool here, right? So let's assume that this is level 1. You notice that there is one called the computation height. By default it's set to 0. Now what this does is that if your room or your wall is at perfectly 0, then that room will take into consideration. If you have wall that is offsetted by, let's say, 100 millimeters, something like that, the computation height will not take account into this room. So what I typically do is that I always put this to at least 4 feet. Okay, just give it like a 4 feet height. The minute you put it 4 feet height, you notice that this wall starts to glow in. Okay. This is a common issues with user. If you have like a very like a sloped site where a lot of the rooms are basically stepped configuration, I would recommend you putting that in. Okay. Normally I just recommend just putting in to all the levels just in case, so that you don't have to worry about all this stuff. So this is a very annoying kind of a scenario where people tends to put in rooms saying that, oh, doesn't work. Then just check on the computation height. All right, next thing I'm going to talk about, elevation fade backgrounds. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up a project, a simple project. So what tends to happen is that what I see most of the time is user likes to fade between different backgrounds just to show the depth, right? So one of the, like in the old days before I think Revit 2017, you weren't able to do that. Like you weren't able to kind of physically uh, physically fade some of the background. Let's say, for example, you want to fade some of this stuff. In the old days, what I typically tell user how to do it is you will go to fill region, select the area, right? And then what you do here is that you go right click, override, and set your surface transparency to, let's say, 50%. And what it does is that it gives you that faded background. For this one, I think 2017 and above, you don't have to do that anymore, because what you can do is that you can go into this hidden menu called Graphics Display Override. There's one called the depth queuing. Okay, if you say show depth queuing, let's say for example here, I'm just going to fade it to, let's say, 30 near. Maybe I should go more. No, probably you're not going to see it for this one because it's so, let's say, does it? Yeah, it kind of faded here, right here, but you're not going to see it, probably not in this elevation. I probably should do it in the other elevation. No, not this one. Let's go to the north and south. So this one you will see it. There's a lot of that depth. So here I'm just going to turn that off, the elevation off. Okay, and then I'm just going to go in here, set my depth queuing, and say I want it to be at least 36%. You notice that right now you will start to see it. So if let's say I want to go back to, let's say, 15, then you start to see that. Now this is kind of like you kind of have to kind of do guesswork. It's not very precise. I don't know what this means. Like 15 to 100 means that 100% it's basically far away. 15% means that it's going. I wish it could be like, oh, there's a distance, right? But it doesn't show anything. So it's like 15%. You can say, okay, you can control how dark you want it to be. Okay, if the printing is too light, then you can just control that. So yeah, start using it. I find it to be very, it's quite good for what it does. But the unfortunate thing is that that percentage is kind of like, it threw me off sometimes. So you kind of play around just to get what you want. So that's depth queuing. All right, next thing I'm going to talk about is the roof tips and tricks. So last night I did a couple of technique how to build a roof. Let's assume that you have this scenario where you have a lot of roof. Okay, so I'm just basically going to go into each one how to create that. Okay, so simple things. If you're building any roof, you start with the roof. It would tell you if you want to go to level 2, you can say no. So what you do here is that by default, it's going to give you all this slope. Okay, what's happening is that once this slopes, it looks like this little guy here, right? And then if you want, what you can do is that if you want to make it more like a ridge kind of a roof, you can select that icon and say click this off, and what happens is that it becomes this two-sided slope roof. Now, if you want to create a roof where this thing is joining into that, so what you can do is that let me copy this. Okay, I'm just going to rotate it. Let's assume that my roof is going to be somewhere there. Let's assume you want this to join into that. So what you can do is you go to this tools in here that is really hidden right there. I know that I wonder why they put it in there, because I find it to be very cumbersome. It's very hidden. So when you click on this, you say, okay, select this particular roof. Come on. What is? Yeah, sometimes the tools is a little bit finicky. So let's assume that one. That's the roof you want. Yeah, it says miss target. Why is that? It's a very odd thing. Sometimes it will work like this. Sometimes it just will not work. I don't know why. Last night I tried, it works. This morning I tried, it's a completely different thing. To get this to be successful, I recommend that you do it on the plan, because 3D sometimes is pretty off. So here I'm just going to do is click on that and click on that. You notice that it's just, yeah, it's a very finicky. This is why I don't recommend. Yeah, you see that it's a very finicky kind of a roof system. I try to select it and then it just tells you it's not working sometimes. So it can get very frustrated. Most cases, it works. All you have to do is just select the surface, select this, it will just join itself. But this one, for some odd reason, it just doesn't want to do it. Last time I tried, it looks like this. But if you do get frustrated, which I understand, so what I typically like to do is that if you get frustrated, you don't care about like what's going on at the bottom. Just basically join it. Just use the join geometry. I mean, join geometry works perfectly fine. Because I find that to be a lot of these tools, since nobody uses a lot of these tools, Autodesk usually don't update it as much, because this tool has been around since the early days of Revit. And the unfortunate thing is that it's very finicky. I just, like, normally when I select certain things, it just will not join. But last night when I tried, it actually joined. So you get like 50-50 chance that it will work and 50-50 chance it will not work. So just be patient. All you have to do is just select the surface and then it will just join. But if it doesn't work, yeah, just keep trying. If not, just use manual. Manual's fine as well. Okay, the next part, this one is quite simple. If you have this sort of a roof like this, if you put, all you have to do, here I'm just going to copy, just edit this. This one is it's pretty simple. If you allow 3 sides to be your angle, it's going to look like that. If you only allow 2 sides, then it becomes like this. This one is kind of simple. If you allow 1 side, then it becomes that kind of a roof configuration. All right, how do you create this? Now, this one is kind of easy. All you have is two roofs. So the first thing you would do is create a roof. Okay, just create a roof. Let's just say no. And what you do here is that if you want an opening, just go offset. Let's assume that this is going to be, let's say 900 for example. That's too little. Let's say 2 meters. And then just making sure that there is no roof there. And once you do that, it becomes a hole. Okay? And the next thing you do is that you can copy this, paste at the same place, edit this, get rid of this, get rid of this, and just select that and say define roof. Okay? And what you have is that you have this roof, but the problem is that it's down below, so what you have to do next is just align it. AL, that's the shortcut. And what you do is that you pick an edge right there, that's the edge, and you pick the other edge. You have to tap it like 3 times, it will just align to the edge. So what you have is that you have this, then you can just define how tall you want this to be. Let's say this one you want 25, or you want it, let's say 45. That looks like that. Okay, just keep in mind is that once you change the angle, this thing will just creep up. Okay, if you want to control it, typically how I do it is that for this roof, I would create like 2 things. One is that if you want to do, like, let's say the proper way of how to do this is you go into the roof itself. Okay, let's assume that there is a level here. I'm just gonna expand to all and see if there's a level. Okay, so let's assume that there is a level here. So what I typically like to do is that I like to create one with the level. So let's assume that this one, I'm going to start with roof edge, for instance. And the next thing you want to do is that rather than aligning up to that roof edge, you can say, okay, that's my roof edge, and set it to base. Okay, now you have to keep in mind to take this into a consideration 300 millimeters. So you kind of have to say, okay, I want this to go down 300 millimeters. Okay, or more than that, sorry. So you can always say that one to there, then it becomes kind of a line. Now for this one, what you have to do is that if you want to keep the angle, right now what happened is that by default your angle is going to be 30 degrees. Okay, doesn't work. So what I typically like to do is that I like to turn this off and create my own slope. So I go slope arrow. Let's say this is my slope arrow coming this way. Here what I would like to do is that I like to put it at default, but the head I like to go roof edge. Okay, so here I'm just going to do the same thing. again, same thing, just say roof edge. And next thing I would do is just mirror it. Okay, just mirror it. Oops, make sure it's mirror it. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Like if you don't do it properly, if they're not aligned, what it does is that it would tell you, nope, doesn't work. Okay, so here, it already done that. Okay, so let me see what's going on. Oh, I see. I forgot to do something. Mistake, rookie mistake. You see that offset? Make sure there's 0. Yeah, every time you do arrow, it would just default that. But if you do that, you can say here is that I want this to be a negative 300, let's say, for example. Oh, actually, I should just don't do that. I should just keep it at 0. There we go. So let's assume that this one, I want to move it down the roof edge by this much. So now what you have is that whenever I move this up, it will follow it. Okay? Just so that you can just basically have that setup. But that's the unfortunate thing about this, is that it will always kind of move up and down. You just have to move up relative to whatever. Okay? That's the unfortunate thing about this. Now there's another way you could do, is that you could do profiling. Okay, you could do a roof, in-place roof, and then you could do profile, then you can adjust that. But this one I'm just showing you, this is how the simple thing, you can just work with it. Alright, the next step talk about is that with this roof, you notice that there's just one combined object. Okay, how do you build this? It's quite simple. All you have to do is, let's do a roof. Okay, so right now they have all the angles. Make sure that all the angles are correct or the same to make this work. The next thing I would do is that I want to do a ridge. Let's say, for example, I'm going to do this ridge. The next thing I would do is just cut it. Okay, and I would just say cut it to, let's say, equal distance if you want. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is that I'll just say make it like that, make it like that, and making sure that this is not defined by slope. Cut it in the middle, SM, if you can. If you can't find it, that's okay. We'll just have to use the middle. Sorry, I'll just do. If you can't find the middle, just draw it in, just trim it, and mirror it. I mean, that's my simplest thing. Now, if you want to create a ridge, then use the slope arrow. Okay, and I'm just going to say slope arrow going up this way, and slope arrow going up this way. And what you're going to do is that for this one, you don't want to default, you want to use slope, and let's assume that this is 25. Okay, you can make it less, and there you go. So that's how you create it. If you want, you can adjust this to be, let's say, higher, let's say 60. It looks like this. Okay, so that's how you do it. Like if you want to do like a ridge in it, right? Because sometimes people like to do this funky kind of a shape. Okay, how you create this? This is quite simple. All you have to do is you draw. Let's say no. All you have to do is just turn this off. I would just say draw a line, draw a line. Okay. Again, it's the same concept as previously. Just do a middle of this. Okay, just mirror it. I'll use this too. Mirror it. Use this too. Mirror it. And then you do slope arrow. It's one slope arrow, two slope arrow, three slope arrow. So you're basically doing a slope arrow at each corner. Yeah, this could be very tedious, but as long as you understand the concept, you would do it. Most often, if it gets too complicated, I just say just do the simplest one. Just make it slope one direction, and then what you do is that you just cut in pieces, and then you just do joint geometry. That's perfectly fine. I mean, there's no right or wrong way to do it. But just expect that whenever you do complicated roofs, sometimes Revit just doesn't understand. So what you want to do is keep it as simple as possible and kind of work your way. Okay, for this one, I'll just say make it slope and make it 30. Sure, that's fine. And when you have that, that's what it looks like. Okay, any questions so far with the roof? No, very simple. Now, just one roof that I always tell user to do is that if you want to do a funky kind of shaped roof, there's always an extrusion. Okay, what extrusion does is that, okay, it needs a surface, right? So what I typically recommend user doing is you would set a reference plane. Let's assume that I'm going to put it right here and say this is going to be my roof. So what this does is that if you choose this roof by extrusion, roof, sure, just say okay. This allows you to do like any kind of a funky shape roof. So you can do that kind of a scenario. I'm just gonna draw. Yeah, let's assume that that's your roof. Okay. So once you get that, now if you want to form it to like a different shape, let's assume that on plan I want it to be cut off, let's say elliptical or whatever. What you can do is that once you get that shape going, now what you can do is that you can click on this, what's known as a vertical. Okay, you select that, and what you can do is that you can just draw, okay, that's my one ellipse, and I want to do other funky design. Let's say assume that that's what I want. I'll just cut it off like there and right there. Now let's say assume that I want to save this, then you just draw the big box on the outside. Okay, it just tells you, oh, can't do it. Yeah, this is the error of that cutting, right? It likes to do holes, so you could do holes but not the other way. So it could do this, right? So you could do that. It works perfectly, but if you want to do outside, it just doesn't want to do it. So the other option I do is that use a component, just go in place model, choose a roof, okay, in place, just say roof void, and what you do is that you just paste the same object in there. So current view, and what you do is that you just say create by extrusion. I should just say paste current view. There we go. Okay. Oh yeah, the line's always isolate category. No, it doesn't do it. Okay, so I'm just gonna delete the lines. That's just driving you nuts. The one thing I always hate Revit is that every time we paste object in, lines always get priorities over the objects. It should be the other way around. You should have like a draw order for objects model. That's one thing that I wish that was put in. Okay, once you have this extruded, then the next thing you do is you set this up as void. Okay, and then what you do here is that you do a cut this from this. Okay, there we go. So you have a funky roof that you can actually use, and you can just basically create a wall. It will just respect it. That's one thing I like about Revit, is that you can draw in the most bizarre kind of a thing, and then what you can do is that you can just put in a wall and it attach to the underside of the roof. Mind you, it will give you this error. The reason why is that sometimes if the wall is, I don't know, for some reason it's just not wanting to, like sometimes it works, like nope, not this one. Let's say you just have to pick the object. Let's say this is the object. Okay, works. So yeah, sometimes it does that. I don't know why it does. Okay, now it works. I guess because when you select that object, it wants to attach to it. It doesn't work. So yeah, just be aware. Okay, so anything question with the roof? Pretty straightforward. I'm not sure if this version accept roof. Let's say here, I'm just going to draw one. But I don't think this version works. Only I think 2018. So if I say pick that one, oh, it does work. Okay, so I think this is a new version. So what you can do is that you can actually draw like a parapet and stuff like that, or anything guardrail. So what you can do is that you can do like a really funky shape with railing, and then what you tell Revit is that just host it to a roof, and then what it does is that it will create this curvature surfaces. I think that's something new in 2017. I don't think 2016. I don't think you can do it. Okay, so yeah, that's the nicest nice thing. You can actually build your curbs and stuff like that. You can use let's say you have a special planters you want to build, like a slope wall, and you want to do this. Yeah, this is perfectly fine. All right, let's talk about high tags coarser with scale. So what happened, this gets everybody go bonkers, because every time when you create an object, okay, Revit will say, okay, high coarser than 100. So if let's say assume that I want to change to 10, no, actually, let's say change to 200, you notice that it disappears. So one of the things that really drives people nuts is that whenever this high coarser, it basically, when you change scale, sometimes the object does not show itself. So one of the things I always tell users to do is that change this to the highest, the biggest scale you can find, 1 to 5,000. Okay, so what happened is that if you change to 5,000, it still shows up. Okay, so regardless of what scale you're in, it will still show up regardless. Okay, and I always use filters. So what happened is that if you have this building section, I typically tell user, if you want, just call this temp section. Okay, and then go into the filter, add the filter. Let's call this as temp section. Okay, what you do here is that you go to section, you go into the I guess this family and type equals temp section. Okay, here this is where the filter becomes very, very powerful, is that you can say, okay, this is the temp section, then you're not going to see it, rather than just do that high coarser, because high coarse, sometimes you want to show it, sometimes you do not want to show it. So I would just say use filters and create multiple different types, so that you can just use the filter and filter them out. All right, hopefully I'm gonna show you the 2D and 3D grids. Okay, so what I typically likes to do with this, let's say I want to create a grid. Let's assume that you want to create a grid. In most cases, when people draw grids, they would draw one right there, they would draw one like there, like that. So you have a mixed match of both different sides of grids. It's annoying because what happened is that whenever you click on this, right, it only exists in this particular view. So when you go to, let's say, level 1, you notice that doesn't show up. So rather than doing that, okay, what I typically like to do here is that I like to create bubbles that has both up and down, right? So in here, what I'm going to do is that you can say 6.5 millimeter. I just typically say this is like a grid N2, and then the other one is grid N1. Okay, you're all going to be using circle anyway, so there's no point. So now what we can do is that grid N1, I want it to fall in line with that, and then here I would just switch it to grid N1. So what happens is that when you do that, you see that it changes globally. Okay, so you can create multiple different types. I know that this can get very annoying. People say, I like to create one. But if you can create one, that's fine, right? Make sure that everybody follows it. The good practice I always do is that if you're doing a grid, so I'm just going to get rid of it. Let's assume that I want a grid 2. Always array it or copy it, okay? Don't go like draw one grid, draw another grid. Don't do that, okay? Because what happens is that consistency becomes an issue. A lot of projects I've seen is where you have this grid, one goes up, the other one goes down. So how you clean it up is what I showed you, is that you have to set up this 2 system where you have one grid is N1 and then the other one's N2, so that it basically creates a unified kind of way.
So one issue I had with this one in one project was,
Yes.
Some of the views were cut off in 2 sheets.
Mm-hmm.
So if I use this one, I
Yes.
wouldn't see the bubble in in the views that I wanted.
Right, right.
So what's the best approach
Okay.
for that?
Yeah, I noticed that some user has having issues. I know what you're trying to get at. Okay, so let's assume that I'm just gonna create a bunch of grids. Okay, create a bunch of grids. Okay, let's assume that there's a grids here, and the one issue that I always encounter is, let's assume that you want to crop this view. Okay, let's assume that this is what you want to do. Now, one of the things I've seen people done, oh yeah, I should create a grid on the opposite side so that so I kind of get what you're going with this. I'm just gonna randomly just put it in. Oh, don't do that. Randomly created that. Let's assume that there's a grid here. Okay, so let's assume that this is your whole grid system. Okay, have everything in it. That's fine. Now, what I typically like to a lot of user I saw is that they like to kind of go not 3D but 2D kind of extent, and start doing this. Actually, no, they always confuse. They always do like 3D, and then they like to drag. Okay, and what happened is that once you drag it, and then you start cropping this view, right? And then you trying to like do that, you notice that this grid always happens. Is that what you're talking about? Okay. So how do you fix this? So how I fix this issue is that you have to make sure you all resets to crop, all of it, right? Resets to crop, resets to crop, resets to crop, resets to crop. Okay? Resets to crop is the best way to kind of, you notice that right now if I crop it, the grid line's no longer there. Because what happens is that if you start kind of manipulating the grid lines based on that particular view, this means that Revit assumes that you want that grid to be displayed, and this is why like it doesn't show up, or it shows up because of that issue. So I'd always tell user, if you want to have maintained the grid to be, this consistency, always reset it. Reset to crop. Okay. If you don't reset it, yeah, you're gonna saw that crop, and then when you kind of push it in, you're gonna see the grids in the middle. So that's one of the tricks that I usually do.
So in these two, let's say that we want to put the first one on one sheet and the next one on the other sheet.
Yes.
Okay. But we want to see the grid bubbles on both.
Mm-hmm. What's the approach, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the best approach is that you do this, duplicate, dependent, okay? So what I typically do with the dependent is that, okay, for this side, I want to show this grid, okay? Again, it's, I typically, here, I duplicate from the original, so I did not reset to crop. So I always say reset to crop. It's the best way. If you don't do it, you notice that previously it just stays the way it's supposed to be. So I always like to do that. Now, the only unfortunate thing about Revit is that it does not allow you to, when I put this closer, the grid line just stays the same. It's like, I think this one is like half an inch or an inch. And that's the unfortunate. I wish Revit has a way to control how tight you want the grid to kind of come into the boundary box. It doesn't have that. So here, what I can do is I just duplicate as dependent, okay? And then what you do here is that you have one sheet, and then you have the other sheets as your grid. So here you have two views. One is one roof, and the other one is the other roof. So that's how I do it. Just do dependent so that they both have the same kind of a scenario. Okay. Now, the other thing you could do with the grid system, all right? If let's assume that your grid line is all over a place, right? It doesn't understand what is going on. So here you notice that this grid is right here, but even though it's there, right? There is a way you can actually control it using scope boxes. So here what I'm going to do is that I'm going to call the scope box, okay? And call it, like, let's say this is grid, Sure, let's go 10 meters. So what I can do is that I'm just going to draw it in. Let's say that this is my extent of my grids. Let's say that's my extent. That's my extent. So what I can do is that I could select all the grids, okay, and say scope box, put it on grid, okay. The nice thing about this is that when you change, it will retain those object elements. So scope box can be very useful to do grids, because what happens is that when you go to elevations, oh yeah, this is not going to work. So I'm going to cut my stuff here. Here's my grid. Where's my grid? Let's assume. Let's go back. There's my grid. Yeah, that's the difficult part about Revit, is that the grid line sometimes may not show up. Oh, actually, you know why? Because I accidentally put away. You notice that right now, if I put away, it doesn't show up, but if I put it closer there, there's a grid line. Now, the nice thing about this is that the grid line, you can actually control it where you want this to be.
So could you explain again how did you set it to grid? I missed that.
Oh, okay, sure. So what I would typically do is that first you do scope box. Here I'll just do grid, let's say 2. And let's assume that I want this to be right here. Okay. Now what you do here is that you can say select that grid, and I want to put it to grid 2.
Okay.
And then what it does is that it will follow that. Now you can always say, okay, I want to go back to grid 1, go back to grid 1. There's an advantage to this. Like you can lock it down, because the nicest thing about this is that you want certain grid to go to display on a parking, and you want certain grids to display on, let's say, the tower. So assuming that when you have the lower level, the underground, to be a different grid system than the top, then I would recommend using scope box. So that way you can control where you want the grids to be. Okay? It's
and
a very...
Could you draw a scope box that's not rectangular? It's like
Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing about scope boxes. Right now there is no way around it, unfortunately, but in the future they will probably provide that. Now,
so for some of the grid lines that you want to make them shorter, you need to actually grab those
yes,
grid lines and
yes,
pull them back.
yeah. I would just say if you want, just do multiple scope boxes, right? To say control grid for, let's say this is a core grid that you want to go from the ground level up to like the roof, right? That would be one grid system. The other one would be parkade grids for the parkade, and then the other one would be just the typical tower grids. So you have like almost like 3 sets of scope boxes just to get one or the other. Okay, the other thing I noticed that a lot of people don't use is this grid system with this multi-segment, right? So what you have here is that you have an arc. So arc is another good way. I usually very rarely see this being used unless you're doing a lot of the corner, a curvy kind of a scenario. I've done it one project with this, but the unfortunate thing about the arc grid is that it's not very flexible in terms of how you do show it up on, your section. It doesn't show up, right? It just only show up on plan. But if you want to control it to show up in multiple view, I usually use the scope box just to control where you want it to go. Okay, for example here, I just do grid 1 or let's say grid 2. That's how I do it. Okay, but you will encounter this quite often. Like if you're working on a much larger, like a theater and all that stuff where a lot of curvature is needed, then you will see a lot of this happening. But just keep in mind, when you cut an elevations and section, it will not show up. So there's a couple of ways you can actually make it display, but unfortunately, it requires you to create a family just to make sure that that's the boundary of your grid. All right, that's pretty much it for now. If you have any question.
Did you talk about the families and the homes?
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. That's a good question. Okay.
I have a question about that one.
Sure. Okay. Let's assume you wanna host a family on, like, let's say a surface, right? Let's open up a new family. That's okay. Let's put in a casework, for instance. Let's say race counter. Sure, let's do that. Okay, assuming that there's nothing hosting this on the wall. Okay, I'm assuming this is good. Now, by default, when you like open up this family, what it does is that you notice that it's always vertical, and it always has workplane base. What I typically like to do is that I like to, if you want to make the casework kind of rotated slightly based on the real world condition, I always check that off, and I always put in workplane base. Okay, because what happens is that workplane base, it means you can actually host it on a surface or a plane. So here, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to create a new project. It's architectural. So what you can do is that you can create, let's say, a reference plane, call this angle, right? So here I'm just going to go into my base and just say, okay, go to project 2. Now, where do you want to host it? You see that right now it gives you 2 options. One, you can paste it on face, and then paste it on a work plane. So this is why I like, for a lot of the time, you can create your families just with nothing, right? I noticed that a lot of user likes to use, when you go template, new family, they would do, let's say, if it's hosted on a wall, put it on the wall, right? And then if you do it like ceiling, do it on the ceiling. I just don't like to do that, because what happens is that you're just making the family more of host dependent, and you cannot break out of it. That's the unfortunate thing. You could still do it on face base. I don't argue with that. But if you want to make your static family static, I would recommend just click on that work based, and what it does is that it will make it into a hosted on face. So that's a good trick, right? And now what I can do is that here I'm gonna make it show up. Let's say set my to angle and make it show. So right now it looks like it's on an angle. So what I can do now is that I could just say hosted or work plane. Okay. Let's say that's my go north. You notice that looks like that. Now what you can do here is that you can rotate this. So you could say place this. It will just rotate it. Okay. That's one thing I like to do. Just host it on a work plane. Is that you're able to rotate this stuff on whatever angle.
Okay, so you did something here that I didn't know.
Oh, okay.
To set,
yeah.
kind of went to the set.
Yes.
That.
Yes, work plane. Yes.
So what I had problem with in one project was to put the parking stalls on a ramp.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a work plane based
yes.
family.
Yes.
But I couldn't get to do it like
on a surface.
On the surface.
Yeah, that one. Okay, you have to be very cognizant about that, right? Because what happened is that, okay, let's assume I'm going to open up a parking. Let's open up a parking kind of a family. Let's say library. We have one for, I believe, site parking. All right, let's assume that you have curb ADA, parking space. That's one of them. Okay, so let's say you open it up. Right now it doesn't say always vertical. Okay, let's assume that that's going to be workplane base. I'm going to load that in project. Okay. Oh, right now it tells me, okay, sure, I'm going to override it. So now what I can do is that for my component, let's say parking. Oh yeah, this is 60 degrees, so I should change it to 90 degrees. There we go. Okay, now it's workplane based. Okay, now keep in mind, you have to be very, very careful, because what I find a lot of user tends to make a mistake in this is, here, let me copy this over. Let's assume that this from here to there is 24. Okay, that's good. When you go to plan itself, it's not truly 2.4 meters. Because what happens is that it's a sloping mechanism. It slopes. It's 2.4 meters. But unfortunately, when you try to like dimension it based on flat plane, it's actually shorter. Okay, so something to keep in mind. I know that some people likes to do this more of a realistic kind of a thing, so that it slopes, everything slopes. But just keep in mind when you're trying to do tagging and stuff like that, like dimensioning based on the real world scenario, it's always going to be slightly shorter. So most cases for parking, I just use what's known as the vertical, always vertical. Work plane base, you can still do work plane, but I would always set to vertical so that here, what I can do is that I can move this to the actual spot. Yeah, this one doesn't give me a reference plane. So let's assume that here I'm just going to say this is 2.4 meter, 2.4 meter. Yeah, it's always going to say that, but that's fine. Yeah, that's, nope, I want to see what's going on.
Yeah, that was actually my problem.
Oh, I see.
Because when you copy it in the on the plan,
yes,
then how would you set it again on that slope? Or
I see. So this is the thing, right? Like all you have to do is just this trigger right here. Always vertical. Always vertical means that it's always going to be projecting on the plan. But if you don't do that, yeah, that's what's happening. And you can say, okay, edit work plane base angle. And it's always going to be like that. Okay, it just like you kind of have to make that decision, like what's more important, like having to show accurately, or do you want to show more of a dimension so that you can snap it back easily. There's always two sets of mindset. Like this one's like, it's kind of like use the judgment base, because what tends to happen is that when you work on parking levels, it's not a very cut and dry, right? Sometimes I use vertical, right? Just basically set it to vertical because I want to dimension them. If you want to be like more accurate, then yeah, you would set it to work plane base and not verticals. Then you can just align it to whatever you want it to be. So it's really depends. I know the early design phase, I would say I would use the method no work plane and not vertical. But once you get into the working drawings, like the construction documentation, I always like to flip it around the other way, because I want my reference to be on the existing location where you want the dimension to go. Because on plan, that's more priority versus the look. So it just depends. Like early design, yes, you can do this, but later on, no, it's completely opposite. Okay. So any questions so far? No? Yeah. Well, one of the questions I always get asked is that what can Revit build, right? Because I know that Revit is very, like, it's not a design model. Well, even though it is a design model, the unfortunate thing is that when you build Revit families, it's always going to be very, how should I say, it's very extruded. And if you want to do like the edge of this, it takes a lot of time to kind of build the component. So what I typically like to do is that if user asks me like, okay, Revit can only build very blocky and not a rendery quality kind of a thing, I always tell people is like, yes, that's true, but at the same time, Revit can build really funky stuff. So one of the things that I kind of tested or experiment is I kind of built this as a test case, right? One of the things I built is Elsa, right, from Frozen. So that's kind of like, okay, looks good. Yeah, the unfortunate thing about this is that, yes, it's a lot of work. You just have to kind of be patient with it. So you can technically build Elsa inside Revit, but it just depends on what you're going to do with this. So I built this as a test case just to prove that you can build complicated stuff, but just keep in mind that yes, it's possible, but it's not practical. This one took me, the face is probably the longest, probably took me like at least 3-4 days just to build the face, because they're symmetrical, right? That's the nice thing about face is that it's symmetrical. So you build one side, you just mirror the opposite side. Hair also take me quite a bit to kind of draw in because they're kind of like modeling kind of a thing. The rest is just mirroring each other. That's fine. Hand is also probably quite the most complicated, but this one is not that bad, right? It's just because it's open up. But if you have like something that's like fist in, it's a little bit more difficult. So yes, you can build it. Complication. Now, one thing weird about Revit modeling is that if you do eyelashes, this one actually takes up the most space, like the size-wise, because I typically here I'll just show you the size of that eyelashes. It just makes no sense. So here you see that eyelashes, eyebrows, sorry, that one, no, eyelashes, it's 10 megabytes just for that eyelashes. I mean, the modeling, it's not complicated. What I did is that I built just kind of like, this is an adaptive component. So I just pick 1, 2, 3 points, 1, 2, 3 points, 1, 2, 3 points, etc. Just repeating it. And what happens is that once I get that, then the size becomes just balloon up in size. So there is no explanation. So overall, this model, yeah, it becomes big. Like, I mean, we're talking about, here, let's see, what's the final size? 77 megs. Yeah, just for a family, right? So it's not very practical, but just for application like this, it's a good to showcase people like what you can build. But the unfortunate thing is that they're not optimized to anything. Hopefully Autodesk has a solution, but for now, no, there's nothing. I just build it, and then that's just the size. So, all right, that concludes the today's session. If you find this is very informative, yeah, please ask me any question. Thank you.